Welcome to a deep dive into something that, well, it touches almost every part of our lives.
Yeah.
Economic opportunity, well-being, and that sometimes elusive idea of a secure, comfortable future.
Yeah, definitely.
We're focusing today on a really thought-provoking article by Adam Stokes titled, What Broke the Australian Dream?
And our goal here is really to cut through the noise, get to the heart of this piece.
Hmm.
It offers what the author presents as a structural explanation for how an economic model that, well, maybe once delivered broad prosperity has shifted towards widespread struggle.
Particularly around housing, right?
Yeah,
That seems key.
absolutely, especially when it comes to something as fundamental as owning a home.
And this article, it isn't just complaining, is it? It sets up a vivid comparison.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Between a past era and today's reality, then it dives deep into what the author sees as systemic failures.
Okay.
Brings in some global examples too, and finishes with a set of, well, quite ambitious proposed reforms.
So it's kind of a diagnosis and a call to action.
Exactly. It's presented very much as a diagnosis of a problem the author sees and a strong call for significant policy change. It's a lens, really, to view some challenging economic trends.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The article starts by painting a picture of the 1950s and 60s, describing what it calls a golden era.
Mm-hmm.
What was life supposedly like then, according to Stokes?
Well, he depicts a time where the norm was that a single income, just one person working, was enough to comfortably support a family,
Comfortably.
meaning they could buy a home and even afford yearly holidays, the whole package.
That sounds, well, almost like ancient history compared to what many people experience today. Are there numbers to back that picture up?
Yeah, the article pulls out some pretty stark figures. In 1955, for instance, a Sydney house apparently cost about £2,500.
Okay, 2,500 pounds. How does that relate to wages back then?
Well, what's incredible, according to the source, is that this was roughly equivalent to just 3 to 4 years of an average wage.
Wow. Just 3 or 4 years work for a house?
That's what the article states. So the link between earning a living and buying a home was fundamentally different.
You can see why he calls it a golden era.
Absolutely. And this accessibility, it was reflected in home ownership rates. The source notes a huge jump from 52% in 1947, peaking at 72% by 1966.
72%?
Yeah, apparently among the highest rates globally back then. And the article attributes part of this to, deliberate government policy that prioritized land availability and construction.
So policy choices helping make it happen.
That's the implication.
Okay, so that's the then. Now let's jump to the now, what the author describes as the 2025 reality. What's the picture today?
Well, the contrast couldn't be sharper, really. The article argues that today, even dual incomes, two people working, often struggle just to cover basic living expenses.
Forgetting saving for a house, just the basics.
Yeah, let alone leaving room for significant savings or, investments.
And the housing situation is, of course, central to the struggle he describes.
It's the focal point for many of the author's arguments, definitely. House prices in major cities like Sydney and Melbourne, they now sit at 8 to 10 times the average household income.
Household, so that's dual income usually.
Right. And in some suburbs, that ratio explodes to 20 times or even more.
20 times. Just putting that in perspective.
Yeah.
That's 20 years of an entire household's income versus 3-4 years of a single income back in the 50s.
Yeah.
The difference is just staggering.
It really highlights the scale of the shift, doesn't it? And this affordability crisis, it's had a direct impact on younger generations.
How so?
Well, homeownership rates for those under 35 have apparently plummeted since the 1980s.
Right.
And it's not just housing costs. The article points out that other necessities, food, electricity, childcare, they've significantly outpaced wage growth across the board.
I remember there was a specific statistic in there that really drove home that divergence between like asset prices and wages.
Yes, that's right. The article highlights Sydney house prices surged by 123% between 2012 and 2022.
123% in wages.
Wages over the same decade grew only 26%.
Wow. So houses going up nearly 5 times faster than wages.
Exactly. That chasm between asset costs and earnings growth is a key part of the author's argument for why the dream feels broken for so many.
Okay, so having laid out this dramatic before and after, the article then transitions into the crucial question. What happened? How did we get from, there to here?
Right, and this is where the author presents his core diagnosis. He identifies what he sees as 3 major systemic failures that have led to this situation.
Okay, let's dive into that diagnosis. What's the first major failure the article zeroes in on?
The first is what the author calls the explosion of new money. He essentially describes it as an inflation engine.
an inflation engine.
Uh,
What does that mean practically?
The argument here is that the Reserve Bank of Australia, the RBA, and commercial banks have drastically increased the money supply, especially, he notes, in response to financial crises like the GFC.
The global financial crisis in '08.
Yeah, that one, and also the recent COVID-19 pandemic, just huge amounts of new money created.
So more dollars circulating. But
Yeah.
what's the problem with that?
Well, the article uses a great analogy. Imagine watering down a glass of cordial.
Okay.
The more water you add, the weaker the flavor becomes, right?
Right.
In this analogy, the water is new money. Adding more money without a proportional increase in actual economic output, like goods and services, effectively dilutes the value of each dollar, makes it weaker.
And the consequence of that dilution, according to the article.
Rampant inflation.
Yeah.
The source points out that this hit a 40-year high of 8% in 2022.
8%. And the real world impact. How does that feel for people?
The example given is pretty relatable. A $100 grocery shop back in 2015 might now cost you $140.
But your wages haven't gone up by 40% to match.
Exactly, wages haven't kept pace. So according to the author, this printing of money and the resulting inflation is a primary driver behind the erosion of people's purchasing power. It hits their financial stability hard.
All right, so if the first failure is about the value of money itself being weakened, what's the second major issue the article identifies?
This one is squarely focused on the housing crisis. Runaway housing demand paired with stifled supply. That's how he frames it.
Okay, demand and supply. What's driving the demand side, according to him?
He argues that policies like negative gearing and capital gains tax exemptions heavily favor property investors over prospective homeowners, people trying to buy their first home.
Can you quickly just remind us what negative gearing is?
Sure. Basically, negative gearing allows property owners to deduct rental property expenses, including their mortgage interest, from their other taxable income, like their salary.
Right.
If those expenses are higher than the rent they get, meaning the property is negatively geared, it creates a tax loss that reduces the tax they pay on their salary.
Ah, I see.
The article argues this incentivizes buying multiple properties purely for investment rather than just one to live in.
Okay, so investors are encouraged to buy, and the article suggests they often outbid first-time buyers.
That's the claim. Wealthier investors using these tax advantages can simply offer more.
Right. What about the other side of the equation, supply?
The source points to restrictive zoning laws and also slow land releases by local and state governments. He sees these as major bottlenecks choking off the supply of new housing, especially where people actually want or need to live.
It always feels a bit strange, though, talking about lack of space or land in Australia, given how huge the country is.
That's a point the author specifically raises. He highlights Australia's incredibly low population density, only about 3.6 people per square kilometer on average.
Tiny.
Yeah, yet he argues our policies make land and housing scarce in key areas, effectively making us act like we're out of space, despite the vast geography.
That juxtaposition is pretty powerful.
Yeah.
Okay, and the third systemic failure identified in the article, what's that?
The third area is what the author terms a hollowed-out productive economy.
Hollowed out, meaning?
The argument here is that Australia has become perhaps overly reliant on exporting raw materials, digging stuff up, iron ore, coal, gas, and selling it overseas.
Not the expense of.
At the expense of developing and supporting our own domestic industries, making things here.
So, less manufacturing.
Precisely. The article discusses what it calls a significant decline, almost a collapse of domestic manufacturing over decades.
And the consequence of that.
Well, it leads to heavy import dependency for many goods, which the author argues makes the economy less resilient, costs local jobs, and maybe even pushes up prices in some cases.
Is there a measure for that?
He quotes a statistic claiming Australia is the least self-sufficient manufacturer in the OECD.
Least self-sufficient in that group of developed countries. That's quite a statement.
It is. And the pandemic really brought that vulnerability into sharp focus, didn't it?
How so?
Well, the source points to shortages of essential supplies like masks and medical equipment early in the COVID crisis. A clear example, he argues, of the risks of relying too heavily on imports for critical goods when global supply chains break down.
Okay, so the author's diagnosis boils down to these three interconnected issues then. The currency's value eroded by too much money printing. The housing market skewed by policies favoring speculation over supply, and the broader economy lacking productive depth because manufacturing declined.
That's the core argument for what broke the dream, according to Adam Stokes. Yes. A sort of three-pronged problem.
The article doesn't just dwell on the problems, though, does it? It then looks internationally.
Yeah, suggesting it doesn't have to be this way. It examines different approaches in other countries.
Kind of like, see, others do it differently.
Exactly. The author uses these global comparisons as practical examples to show that different policy choices can yield different results. It offers a few brief case studies.
Like which countries?
Germany is highlighted for its approach to housing. Apparently, it includes measures to limit speculation and policies that support building ample supply.
Okay, what else?
The USA is mentioned for, in some areas, easing land release processes and putting restrictions on tax benefits for investors, again, aimed at curbing speculative demand.
And on the money front, the inflation issue.
The source points to Switzerland. It argues Switzerland has maintained a much more controlled approach to money printing, resulting in near-zero inflation in some periods, much lower than elsewhere.
Interesting. And there was a local example too, right? Something about energy.
Yes, a particularly striking one closer to home, Western Australia.
What do they do differently?
The article notes that WA has a policy of reserving 10–15% of its natural gas production specifically for domestic use, for locals.
And the result?
The author argues this contributes significantly to lower energy bills for residents and businesses there, compared to the eastern states, like here in Sydney or Melbourne, which export most of their gas.
And there was that rather surprising detail about who pays what for Australian gas.
Yes, the source highlights this paradox. Australians sometimes pay more for their own domestically produced energy than overseas buyers do.
Even after they ship it halfway across the world.
Even after factoring in the costs of liquefaction and shipping abroad. It's a point the author uses to argue that our resource wealth isn't always translating into domestic benefit,
Right, so these examples, they serve as evidence for the author that alternative paths exist. Specific policy decisions matter.
Precisely. They have direct consequences on these key economic indicators, and that leads directly into the article's proposed solutions.
Okay, so how does Adam Stokes propose we rebuild the dream? He outlines 6 bold reforms. What's the first step he suggests?
Well, the first is laser focused on housing. Fix housing, build more, speculate less. That's the heading.
Build more, speculate less. How?
This involves a call for a housing construction boom on a scale not seen since maybe the post-war era.
A massive building program.
Yeah. It includes freeing up more land, streamlining complex zoning laws, cutting red tape, basically, and, critically,
Yes.
phasing out negative gearing, or perhaps keeping it only for genuine new builds to stimulate supply directly.
So targeting it differently.
And actively prioritizing families and first-time buyers over serial investors in the market, shifting the balance.
So tackling both the supply bottlenecks and the demand driven by investment incentives. Okay, what's the proposed fix for the inflation issue? The money printing.
That's reform number 2. Tame inflation, stop printing money. Pretty direct.
How would that work?
The author proposes strict controls on the money supply. He argues the RBA should only increase it in line with actual economic growth, not just creating it out of thin air, essentially.
Tied to real output.
Exactly. He also suggests governments need to run balanced budgets, stop borrowing so much, and calls for reforms to banks to curb what he describes as risky fractional reserve lending practices.
Okay, that's money. What about the hollowed out economy? The manufacturing side?
That's the third reform. Rebuild manufacturing, make more in Australia.
What would we make?
This involves strategically using Australia's vast natural resources domestically to manufacture higher-value goods. He gives examples like green steel, batteries, electric vehicles, things the world needs for the green transition.
So adding value here instead of just exporting raw stuff.
Right. The proposal encourages more research and development, public-private partnerships, and really focusing on reducing import dependency. The argument is this creates jobs and could lower costs for consumers too.
Makes sense. What about those high energy bills we talked about?
That's reform number 4. Slash energy bills, use our own energy.
Like the WA model.
Yes. Building on that WA example, the author advocates for mandating a reserve, maybe 10–15% of gas production for domestic use nationally.
Keep some here.
Keep some here, make it affordable. It also involves investing heavily in renewable energy sources, of course, but ensuring that fossil fuel exports don't come at the expense of affordable, reliable energy for Australian homes and businesses. A balanced approach.
Okay, 4 down. Now, there's one proposal that really jumps out as, well, unconventional in mainstream policy discussions.
Ah, yes. You mean the 5th reform.
Yeah.
Embrace hard money, explore Bitcoin.
Yeah, Bitcoin. How does that fit into fixing the economy?
Well, the author posits that because Bitcoin has a fixed, mathematically verifiable supply, unlike national currencies that can be printed infinitely, it's inherently resistant to the kind of inflation caused by that money printing he identified as a core problem.
So it holds its value better because they can't just make more.
That's the theory presented. He suggests exploring its potential to stabilize savings, maybe build confidence in the financial system in a new way.
How would government explore that?
He even proposes potential early government engagement, perhaps through policies on taxes for crypto, holding some in reserves, or encouraging fintech innovation around it. It's presented as a potential hedge against currency devaluation, a digital hard asset.
That's certainly a forward-looking and probably quite debated idea to include. Okay, and the final reform. Number 6.
The sixth reform is renewed democracy, update the Constitution.
How does changing the Constitution fix the economy?
This proposal is framed more as building a stronger, more modern foundation for economic reform. It suggests Australia should become a republic with its own head of state.
Okay.
And, importantly, enact a Bill of Rights to explicitly protect fundamental liberties like freedom of speech, privacy, and property rights.
And the link to the economy is?
The author seems to argue that these stronger foundations are necessary to empower citizens and enable the kind of bold policy changes he's proposing in the other areas, sort of clearing the political decks.
I see. So these are the 6 key pillars the author sees for turning the situation around, for rebuilding that dream.
Yeah, they're presented as, practical, policy-based, and he frames them as deeply rooted in a vision for national economic renewal. Quite patriotic language at times.
Right. Putting it all together then, what's the author's ultimate vision for Australia if these reforms or something like them were enacted? What's the end goal?
The summary vision painted in the article is really a return to something resembling that golden era ideal, but maybe modernized.
So what does that look like?
A future where potentially a single income can realistically buy a home again, where local industries are vibrant and thriving, making things, where energy bills are significantly lower and predictable, where money holds its value securely over time, democracy feels more robust and relevant, and overall, economic dignity is restored for average citizens. That's the picture.
It's definitely a comprehensive critique.
Wow.
And as we said at the start, a very clear call to action for quite systemic change.
It certainly makes a compelling case, or at least attempts to make a compelling case, for how interconnected many of these economic pain points really are. Housing, inflation, jobs, energy. They're not separate issues in his view.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into Adam Stokes' article, What Broke the Australian Dream. We've explored that stark contrast he draws between a past era of relative economic ease and today's struggles.
Yeah, and looked at his identification of those 3 systemic failures: the inflation from money printing, the housing crisis fueled by speculation and lack of supply, and the weakening of the productive economy.
We saw how the author uses global examples, suggesting alternatives exist, and we laid out those 6 quite bold reforms he proposes to chart a different course for the country.
It's a powerful argument, whether you agree with all of it or not, that economic structures and specific policy choices have profound real-world consequences for people's lives, their ability to achieve basic well-being and security.
Absolutely. So, thinking about everything we've covered from this article, what stands out most to you listening in? From this deep dive into the Australian dream, how do these systemic issues or maybe the proposed reforms resonate with your own experiences or your understanding of the economic challenges facing so many people today?
And maybe here's something else to consider as you mull this over, or building on what the article discussed. Given how deeply interconnected the author claims these problems are, housing, inflation, manufacturing, energy, they all seem linked in his analysis. How might implementing just one of those proposed solutions, say, really tackling housing supply, how might that ripple through and impact the others? Inflation, maybe? Or jobs?
Yeah.
Perhaps in complex or even unexpected ways. Something to think about.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.